When we last left Walt Disney, he was sitting on a park bench, watching his daughters spin in circles on the Griffith Park carousel, wondering why amusement parks had to be so, well, awful. Sticky benches, creaky rides, vendors who looked like they'd lost a fight with a soft-serve machine. Walt had a vision, a place where families could have fun together, a place that was clean, safe, beautiful, and full of stories. And now in part 2, we arrive at the moment where Walt does something that separates dreamers from doers. He decides to build the thing. Not talk about it, not sketch it, not pitch it, build it. And that's when the real chaos begins. The first person to hear Walt's decision was his brother Roy, the man who had spent decades keeping Walt's imagination from bankrupting the company. Roy Disney was the financial grown-up in the room, the human seatbelt, the guy who could look at a spreadsheet and break into a cold sweat. So when Walt walked into Roy's office and essentially said, "I'm going to build a park," Roy probably didn't even look up from his paperwork. He just said words to the effect of, "Walt, that's a screwball idea." But Walt had that look, the one Roy knew too well, the look that meant the train had already left the station, and Roy could either get on board or get run over. I imagine Roy sighed, rubbed his temples, and said something like, "All right, tell me what you need." Walt knew the studio couldn't handle this project. The animators were busy making films, and the studio accountants were already nervous enough. So Walt did something bold and slightly sneaky. He created a brand new company, WED Enterprises, where WED stands for Walter Elias Disney, a private creative workshop, a sandbox for grown-ups, a place where imagination didn't need permission. And he staffed it with some of the most talented and unsuspecting people in Hollywood. People like Harper Goff. Harper was a concept artist with a gift for turning wild ideas into believable worlds. Walt saw one of his sketches and said, "You're hired." Harper said, "For what?" And Walt replied, "I'll tell you later." Classic Walt. We talked about Herb Ryman and the Lost Weekend creating the initial map of Disneyland back in part 1. This map would be key in winning over investors. Walt wanted Disneyland to feel lush and alive, but the land he bought was basically a farmed Anaheim field with a few orange trees and a whole lot of nothing. Bill Evans was the man who turned that nothing into a botanical wonderland. He once said, Walt wanted full-grown trees. I told him that wasn't how trees worked. Walt told me to make them work. So Bill did. C.V. Wood, known as Woody, was the general manager of Disneyland's construction and the first Disneyland employee. He was charismatic, ambitious, and had a talent for getting things done fast. Walt needed a miracle worker. Woody needed a challenge. It was a perfect match, until it wasn't. But that's a story for another episode. Walt needed space. A lot of it. Burbank was too small. Los Angeles, too expensive. So Walt and his team flew over Southern California in a small plane, looking for the perfect spot. When they passed over Anaheim, Walt pointed and said, "There, that's it." He bought 160 acres for around $17 million, about $190 million today. At the time, Anaheim was mostly farmland, cows, citrus groves, mosquitoes, but Walt saw something else. Possibility. Here's the part where Walt's genius and stubbornness collide. Banks didn't want to fund Disneyland. They thought it was too risky, too weird, too Walt. So Walt turned to television, a medium he had once avoided. He pitched a weekly show to ABC. In exchange, ABC would help finance Disneyland. And so the Disneyland TV series was born. Part commercial, part documentary, part fever dream. Walt used it to introduce America to the park before it was even built. He showed concept art, models, and his own enthusiasm, which was more persuasive than any business plan. America fell in love. Investors took notice, and Disneyland got its funding. Construction began on July 21st, 1954. Opening day was scheduled for July 17th, 1955. That gave them 1 year, one single year, to build a city of dreams from scratch. C.V. Wood assembled a construction crew of thousands. They worked around the clock, literally 24 hours a day. Floodlights lit the site at night, making Disneyland look like a glowing alien colony rising from the Anaheim dust. Workers joked that Walt didn't sleep. He just recharged like a robot. During the construction, it seemed that everything that could go wrong did go wrong. When they filled the rivers of America for the first time, the water disappeared completely. It soaked straight into the ground like the earth was drinking a giant glass of Disneyland. Bill Evans shrugged and said, "Well, it's thirsty." They had to line the entire riverbed with clay. Walt didn't yell. He didn't panic. He just said, "We'll fix it. Keep going." When the steel frame for Sleeping Beauty Castle went up, some workers thought it looked too small. They asked Walt if he wanted it bigger. Walt said, "No, make the trees smaller." Forced perspective. Movie magic. Problem solved. The day before opening, workers laid fresh asphalt on Main Street. It was still soft the next morning. Women in high heels sank into the pavement like they were walking through warm brownies. Walt just shook his head and essentially said, "Well, at least it's memorable." These are just a few of the challenges the construction crew had to manage in the 1 year leading up to opening day. Walt visited the construction site constantly. He'd walk around with a rolled-up set of blueprints, pointing at work and saying things like, "Move that tree," or "Shift that building," or "Let's put a river here." One worker said, "Walt changed things so often we stopped asking why. We just did it." Another said, he'd walk up, smile, and say, "I've been thinking." And we knew our day was ruined. But here's the thing. Walt wasn't being difficult. He was being right. He saw details no one else saw. He understood how people would move, look, feel, and experience the park. He wasn't building attractions. He was building a story. And he never asked anyone to work harder than he did. If Walt was on site, you were on site. If Walt was up at 3 a.m., you were up at 3 a.m. His wisdom wasn't always gentle. It was relentless. Building continued on the 5 lands of Disneyland that were features in the Disneyland series. Main Street, USA, was inspired by Walt's childhood home of Marceline, Missouri, a romanticized version of America at the turn of the century. Walt said, "It's not history. It's how we wish history had been." Adventureland was a tribute to Walt's true-life adventure films. Exotic, lush, and full of mystery. Bill Evans planted so many trees that workers joked he was building a jungle in the middle of a desert. Frontierland was formed from Walt's love of the American West. He once said, Frontierland is America's story. It became the largest land in the park, a sweeping tribute to pioneers, cowboys, and tall tales. Fantasyland is the heart of Disneyland. Walt said, Fantasyland is dedicated to the young and the young at heart. It was the place where Disney films came to life. Peter Pan, Snow White, Mr. Toad, and more. Tomorrowland was Walt's vision of the future, as imagined in 1955. Rocket ships, space travel, the promise of a bright tomorrow. Walt said, tomorrow can be a wonderful age, and he meant it. By spring, it was clear. They were behind schedule. Way behind. Roy was panicking. Woody was improvising. Bill Evans was planting trees at 2 a.m. Harper Goff was redesigning daily. Herb Ryman was sketching updates faster than Walt could request them. One worker said, we weren't building a theme park. We were building a miracle. Walt kept pushing, kept encouraging, kept believing. He told the crews, it's kind of fun to do the impossible. They probably didn't think it was fun, but they did the impossible anyway. By early July, Disneyland was still a construction zone. Dirt piles, unfinished buildings, painters dangling from ladders, electricians running cables like they were defusing a bomb. Walt walked the park every day, making notes, giving orders, offering encouragement. He was exhausted, stressed, and running on pure determination. But he never lost sight of the dream. One Imagineer said, Walt could look at chaos and see a finished park. The rest of us couldn't see past the chaos. This is where part 2 ends. The moments before a wish comes true. It's July 16th, 1955. The sun is setting over Anaheim. Workers are still hammering, painting, planting, wiring, sweeping. Walt sits in the middle of Main Street, USA, looking up at Sleeping Beauty Castle. The lights are on, the music is playing. The park is just about ready. I can almost see Roy walking up and sitting beside him. Can you imagine the conversation? Roy finally says, well, you did it. Walt replies, we did it. And then, after a long pause, Walt adds, tomorrow, Roy, the world will be watching. Part 3 begins with that opening day, the most chaotic, disastrous, and triumphant day in Disney history. Thank you for viewing this video. Please consider liking the content and subscribing to our channel. Let us know what you think in the comments below and suggest stories you'd like to see next.